I'm really happy to be talking with Sumitra Badrinathan today about her paper, Educative Interventions to Combat Misinformation, Evidence from a Field Experiment in India. Sumitra is a PhD candidate at the University of Pennsylvania in political science and is working on a range of really exciting projects on misinformation, fake news, and political polarization in India. Well, thanks so much for speaking with me, Sumitra.
Thank you for having me.
So can we start by having you tell us a little bit about the problem that your experiment addresses, about the context of the 2019 elections in India and kind of how misinformation manifested itself in that election?
Yeah, so India is actually one of the fastest digitizing nations in the world right now. We have some of the cheapest data plans. We have some of the cheapest mobile phone devices, and internet is way more accessible now than it ever has been in the country. But this increased access also meant that campaigning for elections took on a pretty different form and has taken on a pretty different form. So in 2019, when I conducted this experiment, one of the features that aided that was the existence of WhatsApp groups. And if you don't know, WhatsApp is this social media application. It's like an encrypted chat based message. Think of like your email plus SMS sort of rolled into one. So nobody outside of a group on WhatsApp even knows that that group exists, right? So parties use this to send messages to people and so on and so forth. Now, a consequence of the growth of that app, and India is the largest customer, is that there was a lot of misinformation and disinformation making rounds before the election. And in the past, rumors that have spread through this app have led to social conflict, violence, even deaths. So 2019 was going to be a crucial election year. And since we know from previous research that information and misinformation can change both attitudes and ultimately vote choice, the kind of broad goal for this project was going to be to see if I could design a study that ended up helping people see the problem of misinformation and then hopefully better able to identify false stories and fake pictures ahead of that election itself.
Great. So there have been a number of ideas proposed, mostly in the US, to reduce misinformation online. Can you tell us a bit about the particulars of the idea that you test and why you thought it would work in this context?
Yeah, there's actually, like you said, a lot of existing literature, mostly in the Western context. And I tend to think of it as like broadly in two camps. One is debunking misinformation. So, an intervention that comes after you've seen a story. And the second type is pre-bunking. So, basically, teaching people tools that allow them to identify false stories in the future. And because of this sort of encrypted nature of WhatsApp, where you can't really get in and see what's going on, and also because the election was upcoming, I sort of knew beforehand that whatever I wanted to do was falling under this pre-bunking strategy. So then the question came to what pre-bunking, what kind of things should I have to do in this context? And talking to people during fieldwork before, I realized that people in the area I surveyed weren't even aware about misinformation. Some of them were new users. They were getting on the internet for the first time in those past few months. They were fascinated with the idea of the internet. So the fact that something they received could possibly be false was not an idea that many people I talked to had even grappled with. So that sort of became the starting point. How do I explain to people that misinformation is out there? But not just that, now that they know that it's out there, can we develop tools, concrete, tangible tools that can be taught to people so they can apply those tools to identify news that may or may not be true? So I selected two of those tools, reverse Google searching images and actually physically showing someone how to navigate a fact checking website. Where is the search bar? How do you get on it? How do you search for stories? So on and so forth. So that's broadly what I thought would work in this context ahead of actually doing it.
Let's a little bit about the experimental design, how you were thinking about testing this out. So who were the participants in the experiment? How did you select them, and what were the different treatment conditions that you assigned them to?
Yeah, so I fielded this study in the state of Bihar in India, and I selected this setting because in the past few years, Bihar has been one of the states with the highest level of internet expansion, which means a lot of these new users to the internet. And we selected participants through a random walk procedure rather than listing households. And it was supposed to be a field face to face survey ahead of the election. So the basic idea of the design involved a survey enumerator going to a respondent's house talking to that person face to face and actively teaching them these tools to help them identify misinformation in the future. So, two tools, showing them how to reverse Google search an image, because I found that from conversations with people that there was a lot of misinformation in the form of fake photographs on WhatsApp, but they're not just fake, they're sort of lifted from one context and used in a completely different context. So, putting it back into Google, finding out the original context, that helped people understand, okay, this is probably not true, or this is misleading information. And then actually showing them how to go about navigating a fact checking website. So enumerators showed those to respondents in their home, but not just that. Then they left respondents with a flyer. The front side of the flyer had general tips to spot misinformation on it, but the flyer also had examples of false stories which have been debunked in the past. So respondents could see how to apply those tools. So, in sum, basically a bundled treatment. And what was the second part of your question about experimental conditions? Um, so there were three experimental groups, two treatment and one control. And the two treatment groups got the same sort of educative learning where the tools were demonstrated to them. The only difference was that in the flyer that they were handed, one group got pro attitudinal stories that were debunked in the flyer, and the other group got counter attitudinal stories. And the control condition was a placebo control condition.
Can you tell us a little bit about why you selected, why you chose to do a placebo-controlled design, and what was in the placebo, and kind of what were you after in separating that out?
Yeah, so going into this, one of the key things for me was to make sure that all the treatments were as congruent as possible, in that the treatment and the control groups only differed in that one of the groups, which is the treatment group, got this intervention. But because of the nature of this study, one of the key aspects of the treatment was also the time, right? So enumerators spent at least 45 minutes, sometimes up to an hour and a half, depending on who offered them tea in the household and stuff like that. An hour and a half with each respondent. So if you take away that intervention, and the control group respondents are only spending about 5 to 10 minutes with respondents. So we didn't want to risk the fact that spending the time rather than the content of the intervention would lead to an effect. So in order to remove that variation, I chose a placebo control where enumerators spent about the same time with respondents, and they gave them a flyer and they demonstrated some things on their iPads. So the techniques that were used were similar, except with the placebo control group, the whole thing was to do with environmental pollution, plastic pollution, and sewage in the neighborhood. So, totally unrelated topic. And then they were left with a flyer on this topic as well, just to make sure that the treatments could be as similar as possible to each other.
I know you thought about a lot about not only what outcomes you should measure, but exactly when to measure them. So could you walk us through what those key outcomes were, and then where in the election cycle you measure them?
Yeah. So, like I mentioned, the key outcome was to make sure that people got better at identifying true from false stories. So, in the outcome measure itself, it's constructed as a count of the number of stories that people got correctly. And to get there, we basically showed people a series of headlines, all actual headlines that went viral. Some were true and some were false. And for each, respondents had to say whether they thought those headlines were true and false. The timing of that outcome measure, though, we didn't measure it as at the same time as the intervention. So, like I mentioned at the start, an election was going on, and normatively I thought it was important that people got the intervention before they voted, because we know from previous studies and we know from anecdotal evidence in India also that a lot of misinformation tends to go viral during and before an election, not after. So it made the most sense from a normative perspective to do the intervention before people voted. So they voted after, and then I measured the outcomes after they had voted. Now, one of the peculiarities of India is that you vote, but then results aren't on the same days. Try think of it as like the US primaries, but Iowa votes, and then you wait for all the states, and then you get the results from Iowa. So people are waiting sometimes for almost up to a month, and it's designed like that for like logistical purposes. So the way it happened was that intervention, then people voted, then I measured the outcomes, and then the results of the election were announced. So the advantage of doing it this way was that the outcomes were not affected by the results itself. So, maybe people would change their opinions about what they thought was true or not true, depending on whether their favorite party won. That didn't happen because the results weren't there. And we could make sure that people voted after the intervention. And there were about 2 weeks between the intervention itself and the outcome. So we're able to measure whether this had an effect over a period of time, which is sort of unusual with these sorts of studies.
Definitely. What did you find?
Yeah, I forgot to mention that. Okay, so broadly, here's what I found. On average, I found that this sort of potentially strong treatment where enumerators spend up to an hour with respondents in their homes did not have an effect on average on ability to identify misinformation. But when I broke down the sample by partisanship, I found some pretty interesting results. And that is that I found that people who supported the BJP, which is the current ruling party and party in power in India at the center, these people's misinformation identification skills got worse with the treatment. So it seemed to sort of have backfired with this subset of people, but only for those stories that were counter attitudinal. So, what that means is these respondents basically doubled down on a false story that was helping their party and didn't change their belief with the treatment. But they said that they believed such stories even more. But that didn't happen with non BJP partisans. With that subset, the treatment seems to have worked. So, my biggest takeaway from this was that even in countries with allegedly weaker partisan identification, people still engage in motivated reasoning. At least during elections, they do.
So how do you think that people who are working on addressing misinformation in low-income democracies should respond to your findings? How should it change how they're trying to solve this problem?
Well, first, let me say there aren't that many people working on it. So if you're watching this video, please consider working on misinformation in a low-income democracy. And I'll try to say why it's so important. Well, not just normatively, because we know that misinformation can lead to huge issues. We're seeing it now in the US about how it can lead to behaviors offline that include even violence. But we need to start looking at maybe different platforms. Over 2 billion people in the world use WhatsApp, but there are only a handful of studies on it. And then we also need to start looking at countries that aren't the United States because the mechanisms of spread of misinformation can be very different. Um, Maybe the tools we'll use will be different, right? Like teaching digital literacy programs as opposed to simple fact checks online that are not even possible in the case of something like WhatsApp. And we shouldn't even assume that findings from Western contexts are applied so easily. Like, I'll give you an example to end. One of the more robust findings from the American literature is that older people are more likely to be vulnerable to false stories, and that education, which is often considered a proxy for political sophistication, can give people tools to counteract information they don't like, and so on and so forth. Now, in the Indian context, in not only this study, but a couple of other surveys that I also have done, I'm consistently finding that older people are better at identifying misinformation. Not only that, education seems to have absolutely no effect, no impact either way. And I don't know the answers to these questions. It needs a lot more theorizing, but that's just to say that we need more people working on it. And we need to first start looking at these countries, not only as academics, but also for government, policymakers, and tech platforms themselves.
Thank you so much, Sumitra. I love this experiment. Thanks so much for taking time to talk to us about it.
Thank you. I love the interest that you have in it. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Awesome.
Is it okay?
Great.